We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Greetings. Welcome to an intercultural communication seminar entitled A Crucial Conversation on Racial Equity. This important event was sponsored by Spokane Community College and took place in October of 2020. This important conversation involved amazing participants from the Spokane community along with educators as well. Here are the participants that were part of our conversation. First of all, Police Chief Craig Meidel, who's the chief of the Spokane Police Department, Betsy Wilkerson, who's on the Spokane City Council, Dr. Scott Finney, who's the Director of Africana Studies at Eastern Washington University, Dr. Lori Hunt, who's the Dean of Student Success at Spokane Community College, and myself, Linda Seppa-Salisbury. I'm a Communication Studies professor here at Spokane Community College. One of the classes I teach is intercultural communication. When you're watching this video, we want you to know that there are two segments to it, two parts to it, and each of those is approximately 35 minutes in length. So you may wish to see the entire video in one showing, or you may want to break it up into two segments. Finally, we want to talk about learning objectives that we would love for you to pay attention to as you listen to this conversation. And learning objectives are takeaway learnings that you could actually use in your own life. So first of all, listen carefully to Dr. Lori Hunt as she discusses why it is so important to have conversations about racial equity today. Next, I talk about the rules and ground rules for difficult conversations, and that if we follow those ground rules, we can have excellent conversations even though the topic is difficult. Next, you'll hear an eloquent description from Dr. Scott Finney about the difference between racial equality and racial equity. Next, Betsy Wilkerson discusses some of the difficult stereotypes that she has had to endure in her experience as an African American. And finally, Police Chief Craig Meidel discusses racial equity as it relates to organizations. We're so excited that you're here to embark on this journey with us and looking at a crucial conversation of racial equity. Thank you so much for being here. Well, good morning. Welcome to a crucial conversation on racial equity here at Spokane Community College. We're so delighted to have everyone here this morning, and we are socially distanced exactly 6 feet apart. We have checked it more than once. So for any of the people who are worrying about that, hey, we're in good shape. I am Linda Seppa-Salisbury, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a 44-year veteran at teaching at SCC, and also a co-advisor for Speak Out, one of the sponsors for this event this morning. And our other moderators down there, would you like to introduce yourself, Lori? Dr. Lori Hunt.
Good morning and welcome to SCC. I'm Dr. Lori Hunt. I'm the Dean of Student Success, and I want to thank you for joining us today as we host this crucial conversation on racial equity.
Yeah. So we are so excited to have all of you here. And not only did we invite you for several reasons, but one was we asked people about each of you. We've been doing some exploring about you, so I want to tell you what other people had to say.
Oh.
And it's so important because in coming to a conversation like this, that's a tough conversation to have sometimes, you want to have people whose heart and mind are in the right place. So I want to start with you. Would you like me to call you Chief, or would you like me to call you Craig?
Craig is fine,
Craig.
Thank you.
Everyone we talked to, including some of the people in your office, said that you were a person of complete integrity and character, and that working for you was an honor. So That really sat well with all of us. And I appreciated meeting with you when you had a meeting with me and how honest you were. It was wonderful. And Betsy Wilkerson from the Spokane City Council. Everyone said she's a powerhouse. She is full of life and honesty and vigor and truth. And I know that to be true from knowing you as a person. So we're so glad you're both here. And Dr. Scott Finney. Everyone said in talking about you that you are a light in a dark world, and that you are the new John Lewis for some of us.
Thank you.
That you exude an ability to talk about tough topics, but to do it with great love and kindness.
Thank you very much.
So Lori and I are so happy to be here with you and talking about a topic that's close to our hearts. And Lori's going to talk for just a minute about why we're doing this, what came up that we decided this was an important thing for SCC. Go for it, Lori.
Thank you, Linda. So for 14 years, the SCC Communications Department and the Speak Out Club have hosted conferences each fall and spring quarter to engage the campus community in dialogue surrounding topics around conversations and communication. These events have provided students the opportunity to explore beyond the classroom and take away strategies of how to effectively communicate with others. Our nation is facing twin pandemics. Not only are we struggling to combat the impacts of COVID-19, but we are also entering a reckoning over racial injustice. We have spent years and years of talking, marching, and speaking out against injustice, but with each step towards progress, we find ourselves falling back into the histories that we should be learning from. So as we planned for today, we wanted to focus on how important conversations like the one we are about to embark in are, and that we can't stop and let these conversations drop. Our hope for today is that this is not only the beginning nor the end of ongoing conversations and discussions about racial equity, and know that this very topic is difficult for people to talk about.
Yes.
Conversations around race and equity can make you uncomfortable, but learning is supposed to feel uncomfortable. If we already knew everything on a topic, we wouldn't have to have these conversations. French philosopher Michel de Montaigne said, "There is no conversation more boring than the one where everybody agrees." So today we want to share the voices of local community leaders making a difference while becoming involved in these crucial conversations as part of their daily routines. We are honored to be learning from your lived experiences and hope you will find that their stories and remarks are helpful to continue these crucial conversations. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So in teaching intercultural communication here at SEC, one of the challenges is to be able, in a classroom setting or any setting, to be able to talk about things where people get uncomfortable and things are difficult topics sometimes. So we've set up, I did some reading and with students set up kind of here's how we do things in these topics, and these might be interesting for you with organizations that you're a part of. But here were some ground rules that we use and that we set in my class. And one is you bring your best self to the conversation, and that requires some self-knowledge, and it also requires some self-awareness that you're an active listener to other people, especially when it's hard and they're saying things that are hard for you to hear. That you're kind and generous and giving other people the benefit of the doubt that they're a good person, even though they may not always agree with you. That you stay engaged even when you feel uncomfortable and defensive and you want to just get up and leave. Some of us are laughing about that one. And be open and suspend judgment. And speak your own truth, but to do it in a way that it comes from your own mind and your own heart. That you lean into discomfort and that you work on empathy with other people. And I would say that for me in teaching the skill of empathy has changed everything in my classrooms, absolutely everything. So those are kind of the same ground rules we're going to use in our talk today. And so we're going to start talking about it this morning. And we wanted to ask each of you, the three of you, to share, first of all, about 5 minutes or so of what racial equity is for you and what have been your own experiences, either positive or difficult with it. And we'll start with Scott.
Great. All right.
Since you're the historian.
That's right, apparently, right? Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you to SCC and Linda and Lori. And Craig and Betsy, thank you for serving the public like you do. It's a great thing.
Yes.
It's a great thing to be a part of that. You know, when you talk about the matter of racial equity, it's a multidimensional issue that requires some context of understanding first. And I'd like to bring out just 4 aspects of the context of this multidimensional issue, racial equality or equity. And the first part is this. Number 1, race relations in this country, as dysfunctional as they are an inherited mess. None of us are responsible for it. It's in its initiation. We've inherited this. And really our job is to do the best we can to make sure what we pass on to the generations behind us is just not as dysfunctional and is somewhat improved. So it's a team effort, and realizing something's been placed on our shoulders. Now what do we do with it as a team? And then secondly, I think when you look at race in this country, really what we're talking about is the ironic inconsistencies of human nature. And it's more pronounced in racial issues in this country, but that's this common thread. You know, for instance, Thomas Jefferson, a wonderful mind, and what he wrote regarding the Declaration of Independence, you know, next to the Bible, I don't know if there's a better laid out principle of how behavior should be. And yet, at the same time, he owned slaves and fathered children through a slave. So you've got this ironic inconsistency going on. And so that's part of what we're dealing with. This is something within human nature. And then thirdly, you know, we're the only country that dares to say everyone's an immigrant, and yet we all are going to be treated as first-class citizens. Yeah. You know, our motto for this country is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And so that's a wonderful aspiration, but it's also an indictment as to where are we actually? How much do we have? You could put it this way, out of many people, one country, out of many races, one nation. How well are we doing? We're the only country that's practicing such what we call a great experiment, as historians call it. And then in light of that, can we have differences and yet still have harmony? And then number 4, I'd like to ask you all just to consider, not to answer, but where is the United States? Are we monocultural? Or are we on the spectrum? Or are we non-discriminatory? Or are we actually multicultural? And I think everyone listening and everyone today has to consider in what region you live and what your lived experiences have told you. Are we a monocultural country? Have we advanced to non-discriminatory? Or are we somewhere in between those two? Or dare we say, are we multicultural? Which means that we celebrate differences and we see differences actually as an asset rather than a liability. So that's kind of the context of what I see as when it comes to racial equality's 4 aspects. Now, equity goes farther than equality to achieve fairness and impartiality. I think we all know, and we're all here, based on our human conscience and based on the fact of being social beings, we want fairness and impartiality. Now, equality, though, is actually trying to pursue that, but it's in the way of giving everyone the exact same treatment. Whereas equity takes into account that everyone's starting point isn't exactly the same, and so therefore, those acts of same treatment won't equal to impartiality and fairness. For instance, if you have a person that is 5 foot tall, and he's trying to look at a baseball game that has a wall that's actually 6 foot, you can bring in a crate that is exactly 1.5 foot taller that they could stand on and they could see the baseball game. But someone who is 4 feet tall, you bring in a 1.5 foot crate, they still see the wall, not the game. So equality, same treatment, doesn't result in access to the same benefit. And so what you'd have to do is bring in another crate that's another foot tall. Then what you have are 2 being able to see the game over the wall. So equal treatment is okay as a starting point if everything else is the same. But once you have difference in starting point, then equity comes into account. So when you tie that into racial equality, here's an example in history. In April of 1865, we, of course, had 4 million African-American slaves set free, and they were told, the males were, sorry, my sisters, the males were told, that they have a right to vote. I don't know how much longer it took for our sisters to be acknowledged as intelligent enough to do that. But listen to this. Those black males were told, you have the right to vote. But actually, if you say equal treatment means, yeah, just go up and vote. What about the matter of illiteracy? What about the matter of 225 years of never being granted education? How can you say now you have the right to vote? Everyone, every male is equal. So you could see equity would take into account the lack of education, and also the intimidation, the fear, and the lynching that goes along with voting since 1865. And it wasn't until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that Dr. King and I would say President Johnson passed, that African Americans in the South voted for the first time. 75% of African Americans voted for the first time in 1965. Wow. And that's 100 years after the Civil War. So equality on paper says all males can vote. But it took 100 years for equity to come in, and it took the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So in that sense, when you talk about applied racial equity, you're talking about taking into account lived experiences that vary and that differ according to groups of people. And it's not to hand someone something, but it's to hand up someone who has been under a kind of gravitational pull of injustice, a gravitational pull of discrimination. And the beauty of it all is that in the end, everyone then could have equal access to the benefits in the future, what this country provides. And so as a result, in my mind, racial equity demands that we have a Department of Sustainability, Equity, and Reconciliation. And until we have that, I don't see how we can have racial equity in this country. It'll be coming and going, it'll be sporadic. But unless we have this department, what I call Department of Reconciliation, Equity, and Sustainability, just as we saw in South Africa, you need to take into account the lived experiences and what oppression has done to the oppressor and the oppressed to even things out, to really reach e pluribus unum.
Thank you.
Okay, you bet.
Betsy, what's equity, racial equity to you, and what have been your personal and professional experiences?
Well, first of all, Dr. Scott, thanks for kind of laying that framework for our conversation. You know, on a personal level, I think you can't change a thing till you name a thing. And for many, we don't want to call it racism. We don't want to call it inequity. There are lots of things we want to call it, but that's not what it is. So I think for me, really facing what that is on all levels, and I believe we're on the spectrum. I don't think we have arrived. That's just my personal experience. I haven't gotten there yet. So for me, it would be undoing systemic racism in organizations. Because on a personal level, that's a Herculean lift, but organizations is where we can actually impact people in a more holistic way. So what does it look like when we change the culture of government to be equal, that everybody has the right height crate to see over the fence, or what does that look like in criminal justice? So that's what I see. It has been just a lifetime. And we don't talk about, at least not us in the Black community, about the violence that's been perpetrated toward Black folks and folks of color. I mean, just since the beginning, how that has affected everything that we do, and for the people who did the violence to us. But how within that system, since we had no way to express ourselves, and this is, people can agree or disagree, we didn't have the political capital around racism to speak out, to make change, couldn't talk back to our bosses. And so in many ways, we turned on each other. So we're angry and frustrated, and we needed to lash out. And who do we normally lash out to? The people who are closest to us. because people of color didn't have any other venue to really express or exhibit how racism was really impacting them. You know, it is a complex issue. It goes way past color. You know, it just goes way past color.
Yes.
I just think there's challenges. And for me personally, I think I have a double whammy. I'm black and I'm a woman.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
And then to layer on top of that, I was a black single mom woman, 2 kids. The challenge for me was not to be labeled and not for my children to be labeled. That old stereotype, oh, there's another black mom on welfare and their kids will be on welfare and it'll be generational. And that was the benchmark for me, is not to fall into that, not let society define me. And I think we have allowed, in many ways, society just to paint us all with this brush, and that's not okay. So racial injustice or equity would be, we actually look at the person and get beyond the color. Just open the book. I tell folks, just open the book. You know what? It could be a good read or a bad read, but you can't judge it by the cover. You just can't. So, so that's kind of my initial thoughts on that, just going forward. Lots of work to do.
Lots of work to do. Craig, how about you? Well, how do you see racial equity, and personally or professionally, how is that impacting what you're doing with the Spokane Police Department?
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here.
Oh,
yeah, this is,
delighted.
yeah, especially for the last 4 years or so since I've been in my position as the chief of police. You know, we really are the most visible form of government. So every time someone goes out and they're around, we represent government probably more than any other institute. And as such, we have a major role to play in helping a community heal. And so the concept of equity, bias, implicit bias, explicit bias, disproportionality in contacts, the full gamut really rested on the shoulders of SPD. And as the chief of police, it really rested on me as well. And it is one of those things, and I appreciated what the good doctor said, is we inherited this. You know, we didn't create it, we inherited it, but we also have a role to play in helping to move the healing forward and the fixing of it forward as well. So from a professional standpoint, you know, I really made a concerted effort to reach out to mainly starting out with the African American community, and then that led to reaching out to other community of color as well. And you know, it started out with really trying to get to know them and connect with them to understand their perspective, and having some very raw conversations. I appreciated one of the things that you'd said at the very beginning is that you have to be willing to be uncomfortable, and nobody initially likes to be uncomfortable. And in some of these conversations, I found myself very uncomfortable, and typically the human response when you're uncomfortable is to want to disengage or put walls up.
Yes.
You know, and I'm going to give you a good example of how this has impacted me, both professionally and personally as well. One of the ways that we can really move forward is getting to know the other, whatever the other is, and I really formed some really good friendships because of my position, and had some very raw conversations. There are conversations I probably otherwise would not have had were I not in this position, and realized I have a huge role to play, and probably in the police department, the biggest role to play in helping to heal. You know, and one of the conversations we had surrounding equity and equality as it applies today was slavery. And I remember having a conversation with someone who I truly consider a friend, and I told him, you know, when I hear you talk about slavery, and I'm using this as an example, my walls go up and I get defensive because I didn't own slaves. I'm sure my forefathers weren't even in the United States, and it feels like I'm being blamed for something I had no control over and that I wouldn't have been involved in. My friend pointed out, because of that relationship, we're not blaming you when we bring that up. We're not saying that you're the one who caused racism or you supported racism. What we're asking you to do is acknowledge not only that it occurred, not only that it is evil for one human to own another human and treat them like property and abuse them. But we need you to acknowledge it as well so that you can help us heal. In the process of acknowledging it, you're also at some level making a statement that you're not going to let that happen again, and not in terms of slavery as it looked 200 years ago, but different levels of slavery. Slavery to the justice system, slavery to the government, slavery to the health system. It comes in many different lenses, and so by you acknowledging that it happened and it occurred and it was an evil thing, you are acknowledging that you are going to take steps to make sure whatever form it takes in modern days, it's not going to occur again. And that really helped open my eyes up to the whole concept of equality and equity. The interesting thing, too, is if you see Lady Justice, right? Lady Justice is holding us scales, and she's blind, not blind, but she has a blindfold on. And the whole concept of that is justice should be blind. I think what you're seeing, and I'm going to rephrase that, not I think, what you're seeing, though, is in modern justice systems, Lady Justice isn't blind, and I don't know that she should be blind, because everybody has their different needs. And one of the things you're seeing, especially here in Spokane, is a lot of offender-based programs, which means we're going to base our response to you on what your needs are. Is it education? Is it addiction? Is it mental health? Is it homelessness? Do you need a job? And so I think what you're seeing is the justice system is really starting to evolve as well, as it should, if it's going to be more effective. So from a professional standpoint, I think I'm also seeing that this equality and equity has a role to play in response of the justice system to community of color as well.
Linda, can I just make a comment about that, about Lady Justice? Sure. No, she's not blind. She has, her eyes are covered. But I thought about just how thick was that covering? So can Lady Justice see through that? That's always just been a thing that I've had in my mind.
That's great. Well, I think one of the things, too, and you're talking about this and what you're sharing, is that I think that a lot of times when this topic comes up, you can keep it at a mind intellectual level, but when it starts to change is when your heart gets involved. And when you hear stories and when you listen. And this summer was huge for me because I was challenged to start reading about equity issues. I joined the National Equity Project, and I couldn't stop crying. I still can't. I watched John Lewis's funeral, all of it. I watched the whole thing, and I was beating myself up because I knew who he was. I knew he'd been a legislator from Georgia. I knew about the facts about him, but the more I watched and the more I listened, and the more I heard speeches that he had given, the more I knew the soul and the heart of who he was. And how could I have missed him in all the history classes that I took? How did I not know more about who he was? And so I meant it when I said, "You're my John Lewis," and that the change that he made because of his heart and how he talked about it. He talked about the pain. He talked about being hit over the head and having a skull fracture happen on that march with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the way he talked about it was a way that we could hear it, and he wasn't always blaming people, but he was straightforward, and he told the truth of the pain and the hurt. And I think when we put our defenses down, then we can start to let in that this is another human being. And when he talked about the fact that he had been 16 years old and he went to the library to get his library card, and they wouldn't give it to him because of the color of his skin, and I was thinking, how did his mom feel when he came home? And I just can't get over that. But for a long time for me, it was up here. And I learned a lot at Bethel. I learned a lot at Bethel, going from almost 100% Caucasian congregation to, what would you say, Betsy, 95% black?
How about we go mixed?
Yeah. Yeah. And so it was like I'm in that role of being the learner and sitting next to Roberta Green, Sister Roberta. And you were so gracious in helping me learn. And I think when we can be gracious with each other and not assume the worst, that we really make progress. And I tell your story about your senior prom and every intercultural class. I've never gotten over that.
Wow, okay. Wow, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Sometime he can tell you that story if he chooses
Sure, sure.
to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You know, when asked about how has racial equity impacted my life, I think of W.B. Du Bois's comment or question is, can I be black and American? And so this is a constant struggle, a constant, thing we face, is the stigma of skin color as a result of 225 years of slavery and 345 years of racial segregation, from 1619 to 1964. So when you put those two compounds together, it's a day-to-day, once I leave my front door, I'm faced with this issue. Can I be American and black? Can I be black and American? Or do I have to let go of one for the sake of the other? And issues are always going on in this way. And when someone's looking at me in a department store, I don't know, is that indigestion that they have, or is it my skin color that they don't like? It's just a constant, ongoing thing. And Linda mentioned a story that I accounted when I was a senior in Oakland, California. I was a high school vibrant young man, and I had a date, and my girlfriend happened to be of Italian descent, or my date that night. And here's the striking thing. I could not take her to my senior prom arm in arm. I couldn't go to her parents' home. I had to actually have a white friend show up at the door of my date and hand her my corsage and so on and greet the parents. I was 2 blocks down the road waiting to meet her afterwards because her father said if she ever dated outside of her race, he would disown her. And so we went to the prom, took 2 sets of pictures, the fake date and the real date. And then I dropped her off 2 blocks away, and the fake date, brought her back home. And I realized at the age of 17, here I am, I'm trying to get my straight A's, I'm valedictorian, student body president, and yet I'm not being judged by the content of my character.
Yes.
I'm being absolutely stigmatized by my skin color and my genetic characteristics. And so racial equity is actually saying we want to advance from hearing to listening. Hearing is one thing, and a lot of people hear, but not many people listen, because listening demands that you drop your perspective.
Yes.
And that you validate the lived experiences of others that don't match yours.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how much and how willing are we able to advance as a country to go beyond just hearing, but go to the point of listening. And then once we're there, listening can eliminate the suspicion that has kind of dominated race relations in this country. And actually listening can bring in a sense of trust and mutuality. And there's a possibility for the next generation behind us if we're willing to dismantle the impact and the effect of slavery, Craig, like you mentioned, the long shadow that slavery has forecasted upon African Americans when it comes to education provided K through 12 for folks on the South Hill compared to those in the inner city of Chicago. It's not apples to apples. So you can't expect graduation rates to be the same. You can't expect SAT scores, which apparently are beginning to melt away, to be the same. And surely, as a result, wealth, income, generational income, and so on, will be greatly impacted by the lack of equity. So I think it's a personal thing, it's a social thing, but I think we need to start by being willing to drop our perspective and to validate others' lived experiences. And I'm so glad to hear both of you as leaders in our community, I believe, even promoting that and living that yourself. So I'm encouraged by what I've heard so far today.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall shall